Hi everyone. Today we are going to talk about animals, basic principles of animal form and function, and we're also going to finish up parts of the endocrine system as we talk about animals. So, our overview of animal form and function. First of all, we need to know what the term anatomy means. Anatomy is the study of the form of an organism. So, what are the parts? What's the structure? And then physiology is the study of the biological functions of an organism. So how those parts work, how they work together, how cells and tissue are going to work together to perform a function. Form and function are closely related, and this is a theme that we have really seen all year, is that the function of parts of cells is related to the way that those parts and cells and tissues are structured. So most animals are going to be multicellular, and organisms that are multicellular allow for cell specialization, which means that different cells perform different specialized or specific functions. So we really, like it's in a multicellular organism, tasks are getting divided up, right? Some cells work to be neural cells. Other cells work to be muscle cells. Different cells are going to work doing the cells specific for being in the blood. So we're dividing up the tasks, and that is cell specialization. Animal bodies are characterized by layers of organization. And we can see that on the bottom here in the picture, that atoms and molecules make up a cell, cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, and organs make up organ systems. It says at the top, cells form a functional animal body through emergent properties that arise from levels of structural and functional organization. So some of the most important ones here, a tissue is a group of cells that have a similar function. And then an organ is a group of different tissues that have a similar function, right? So all of the cells that are related to secreting gastric juice are going to make up this tissue to line the stomach, and the tissue to line the stomach, along with muscle tissue and blood vessel tissue, is going to make up the stomach, which is an organ. And then similar organs are going to make up an organ system. Organ systems are groups of organs that work together. In terms of all of our organ systems, you can see many of them here. We're not going to read through all of these, but you can get an idea. You've got a digestive system, a circulatory system, a respiratory system, immune, which we'll go over later, excretory involving your kidneys and your bladder, the endocrine system made up of all the different endocrine glands that work for communication in your body, reproductive system, your nervous tissue, your spinal cord and brain, integumentary, the skin and hair and sweat glands, your bones, and then your muscular system made up of muscles. The specialized complex organ systems of animals are built from really a limited set of cell and tissue types. We sort of group tissues into 4 different categories. We group them into epithelial, which is like covering, so lining the inside of a cavity or lining the outside of an organ. Connective tissue, which is here. So fat, the adipose tissue, which contains fat, is going to be connective tissue. Other padding tissue, bone counts as connective tissue, tendon, ligaments, things like that. Muscle tissue, we find muscle tissue in your heart, cardiac muscle. We find it in our digestive organs. We find it in our blood vessels. We find it in our skeletal muscles. And then nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is for our nervous system, and it involves communication. So here we see an example of the main tissue types. So blood and connective, skeletal muscle, epithelial, nervous tissue. And then we can see it again here. Okay, so another thing that we need to be able to do is to make connections between different ideas. So here it says, although plant anatomy and animal anatomy are going to be different, they have adapted to a shared set of challenges. And let's look at what some of these challenges are so you can get an idea about these connections. So first of all, we have response to the environment. both plants and animals need to respond to the environment, specifically, say, sunlight, right? So the floral head of a sunflower has things called photoreceptors. Photoreceptors are proteins that can determine which way the light is coming from and if light is there at all. And similarly, an insect eye or our eye are going to have photoreceptor cells as well that can detect light. So even though the photoreceptors in plants and the photoreceptor cells in animals are very different, we have responded in a similar way to an environmental challenge, knowing when it's light. Nutritional mode. This is one we know a lot about. We know about leaves. Leaves have a broad, flat surface like a solar panel because broad, flat surfaces are good at collecting light, which is going to increase photosynthesis. And we know that photosynthesis is how a plant gets sugar. Now, a bobcat is not going to have a broad, flat surface, but a bobcat has its own adaptations to allow it to get nutrition as well. A bobcat has stealth, speed, sharp claws, teeth, ears that can move, right, to track prey. So a bobcat has its own set of specialized adaptations to help get its nutrition. Growth and regulation in terms of hormones. Hormones, as we're going to learn next week, are going to control growth patterns. So here, hormones like gibberellins and auxin are going to control this seedling's development, just like hormones are going to control the growth of this lizard, which is molting. So because this lizard is growing, it needs to shed its outer layer so it can get bigger. All right. Other connections and other challenges to overcome. Transport. So here we see the xylem and phloem of plants. They kind of look like veins. And then we have the circulatory system, which is also a group of tubes. Reproduction. We need food reserves, right? Plants need food reserves. So here you see the peas, which are really seeds, and they contain some stored starch to help the baby seedlings grow in the same way that these piglets need food that is stored from the mother, like all mammals, producing milk. And then absorption. So here's another similarity. Roots have root hairs. So these root hairs basically increase the surface area of the root, allowing the plant to get access to more water. And in the same way, this is the inside of an intestine. And notice all these little finger-like projections that reach out because the intestines absorb the nutrients that we eat. So they are trying to absorb as many nutrients as possible. So there's some similarities there. And then gas exchange. Both plants and animals need to exchange gases. Here we have the mesophyll of a leaf, so it's like the spongy inner part of a leaf, and these cells have all of these open spaces like a sponge to trap air. Specifically, it's a place for carbon dioxide to get trapped so it can go into the plant. In the same way, our lungs have open spaces to trap air, oxygen, and to let carbon dioxide out. So similar adaptations to similar problems. Now, we have talked about the endocrine system. We're going to review it a little bit right now, but it's also important to note that plants also have hormones that we'll talk about next week. So it's not just animals that have hormones, plants have them as well. So in terms of communication, specifically in animals, so now we're just going to talk mainly about animals. Animals have a nervous system and an endocrine system, which, as we learned yesterday, are going to interact with one another to communicate in order for growth and development to occur. And we know that this is going to be governed by hormones. Now, some hormones are governed through negative feedback. You see that on the side here. So negative feedback is basically when we produce a hormone and the production or the response of that hormone is going to shut down its own pathway. This is something that we've talked about a few times over the past year, that this endocrine cell is going to make a hormone. This hormone is going to cause something to happen in the target cell, and that response is going to shut down the endocrine cell from producing the hormone. So it's a way of maintaining homeostasis, right? Our endocrine system maintains itself through negative feedback. We keep homeostasis through negative feedback. An example might be in our pancreas. So the very beginning of our small intestine is called the duodenum, and this is the part of the small intestine that receives food from your stomach. So what is the food going to be like after it goes through your stomach? It's going to be very acidic, so a very low pH. And that's okay in your stomach, but it's not okay in your duodenum. So your duodenum realizes this. Okay, the pH has dropped, and we're in real danger from all of this acid that is present in our tissue. So your duodenum releases secretin. Secretin is a hormone that's going to go through your bloodstream, but specifically target pancreatic cells. And it's going to tell your pancreatic cells, hey, make sodium bicarbonate, which is a buffer, which is going to raise the pH to prevent the acidity from harming our duodenum. So it's negative feedback. We have a lower pH, so we create something to make sure the pH doesn't get too low, so to counteract that change. For many hormones, secretion is triggered when the nervous system detects a stimulus. Here is an example of that. In vertebrates, neuroendocrine signaling involves the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So here we have some endocrine signaling. This is actually positive feedback, and I'm going to write that out here. Positive feedback as opposed to negative feedback. So in positive feedback, we have a newborn baby that is hungry. And so it's going to get its nutrition from the mother. It's going to get milk. And the nerves surrounding the tissue are going to sense that there is feeding behavior going on. And it's going to send that to the brain. So the brain knows, okay, there's a newborn baby trying to eat. Let's release oxytocin. So oxytocin is released. And the oxytocin, among other things, is going to stimulate the milk gland. It's going to get it going. It's got a muscle nearby that's going to get it pumping and also creating milk. So your endocrine system is going to be involved here. Now, what's happening is that because more milk is being released, the baby is going to start suckling a little bit harder. And that's going to, again, signal the brain that there is still feeding behavior going on. So release more oxytocin. And the more oxytocin is going to stimulate more suckling. And so we're going to have this, not a regulatory behavior, but an amplification, which is different. Right? This isn't negative feedback. It's positive feedback. We are releasing more and more and more and more milk. We're going further with this response. Negative feedback is a tamping down of a response. Positive feedback is amplifying a response, which is what we see here. Negative feedback is for the long term. This is for the short term. This does not happen forever. This happens for a short time until feeding is over. So here we have a breakdown of our positive feedback example, oxytocin signaling. You can read through this on your own, but it's pretty much the same thing that I just mentioned. All right, and a few other things that we're going to go over. Feedback control maintains the internal environment of many animals. So again, still talking about homeostasis, and specifically we're going to be talking about thermoregulation. So in terms of animals, there are two different types. There is a regulator, which usually we refer to as a warm-blooded animal or an endotherm. And these are animals that use internal control mechanisms to moderate the internal changes. So we're going to determine what the internal conditions are like. Even when the outside world is fluctuating, even when the temperature is changing, even when the humidity is changing, even when we're on land versus in water, warm-blooded or endothermic organisms are going to continue to make the necessary changes to keep the internal environment the same. A conformer, also called a cold-blooded or exothermic organism, is going to allow its internal conditions to vary pretty widely. It's not going to have the same mechanisms of control. So when it gets warmer, an exotherm is simply going to get warmer. And when it gets colder, an exotherm is simply going to get colder. It's not going to regulate its temperature. Animals may regulate some variables while conforming to others. So cold-blooded organisms or exotherms may not regulate their temperature, but they are going to have to regulate some things like salinity or water or blood sugar. So it's not that a conformer conforms in every single way possible. We're typically talking just about temperature here. So temperature is what we're going to stick to as we go forward. Here we have two different organisms. We have a river otter and we have a bass. So notice the river otter, as the ambient temperature increases, the river otter stays at the same temperature because it is a regulator. It regulates its own temperature. The bass, though, can go from very cold to very warm. Its body temperature is going to fluctuate wildly. Warm-blooded organisms, endotherms, would never be able to do that. Organisms use homeostasis to maintain a steady state or internal balance regardless of the external environment. Again, examples of that could be body temp, it could be your blood pH, it could be blood glucose, it could be anything else, salinity as well. So mechanisms of homeostasis moderate changes in the internal environment for a given variable. If we fluctuate above or below a set point, that's going to serve as a stimulus, and any fluctuation is going to be detected by a sensor, which is going to trigger a response. All right, so let's take a look at an example of that. So let's use a thermostat. Here we know that we want a room to be 20 degrees Celsius. And what we're going to do is we set our thermostat at 20 degrees Celsius. We don't want it to go above, we don't want it to go below. So if the room temperature starts to increase, it gets too hot, then the thermostat is going to tell our heater, hey, it's time to turn off, right? The heater turns off, so over time, the room temperature decreases until it gets to that set point again. Now, if the temperature goes below the set point, then the room temperature is going to decrease too far below 20 degrees Celsius, and that's going to cause our heater to come on and to heat up the room. The room is going to get warmer, so the room temperature is going to increase until it reaches that set point at which it may stop. So like this thermostat, many mechanisms in our body are going to be regulating things this way, with temperature, with blood glucose, we talked about with the pancreas. We talked about it with the pH of the intestines. So the dynamic equilibrium of homeostasis is maintained via negative feedback, which helps return a variable to normal. That's going to be very common. There is also positive feedback, which is going to amplify a stimulus and does not usually contribute to homeostasis. So let's review negative feedback first. Negative feedback, the response is to counteract the change, to return it to its original condition. So negative because it negates the initial change. So just like our thermostat example, that is negative feedback. Negative feedback maintains body temperature through the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is typically in charge of body temperature. So when the body temperature drops, nerve endings are going to transmit the change to the hypothalamus, which is then going to cause some other mechanisms. It might cause your body to start shivering. It might cause blood vessel constriction, an increase in your metabolic rate, all of these things to help raise your body temperature back up. That's negative feedback. Here we see it happening, that the body temperature has decreased, and therefore it is going to cause a series of events involving your hypothalamus, which cause you to shiver, which will make your body temperature go back up. Positive feedback intensifies the original change. Positive feedback is typically self-limiting. It's not going to go on forever. An example could be during labor, again, involving oxytocin. So here we have the delivery of a baby. So here we have the babies ready to come out through the cervix. The cervix is a small opening that has to dilate. That means it needs to get wider. As the baby pushes against the cervix, it sends a message to your brain. Your brain then sends out oxytocin. Oxytocin helps to dilate the cervix, and it also helps the uterus contract. Both of those things are going to help to push the baby out. So as the baby pushes against the cervix, it keeps sending a message to the brain, which keeps sending out more oxytocin. That more oxytocin is going to make more contractions. It's going to dilate the cervix even further, and eventually it will be enough to deliver the baby. So positive feedback, again, it's self-limiting. It doesn't go on forever. So here is that breakdown. Labor contractions force the baby's head against the cervix, causing it to dilate, telling the hypothalamus, which will release oxytocin, which will cause an even bigger response of contractions and cervix dilation. Homeostasis is maintained by body systems working together as a team. Numerous mechanisms constantly respond to various stimuli that can change as a result of the animal's activities and as a result of the changes that happen in the environment. Okay, sometimes homeostasis can be changed. An example of this is an animal or plant's circadian rhythm. So our circadian rhythm is our 24-hour rhythm. It guides our sleep, and it guides when our energy is going to be higher or lower. And it changes about every 24 hours, but it's also going to change as the day length changes, so the amount of sunlight. So homeostasis can actually adjust due to changes in the external environment. So, for example, we have a pretty typical circadian rhythm with our body temperature, with melatonin concentrations. This is a hormone related to feeling tired. But in the winter, when the nighttime is longer, and in the summer, when the nighttime is shorter, our circadian rhythm is going to adjust a little bit to deal with those changes. Why is homeostasis important? It's important for many reasons. A few here. Proteins, when our body, its internal environment gets messed up, then it could denature proteins, right? If there's too much salinity, too low of pH, our proteins can denature, and that can cause us not to be able to do the things that we need to do. A change in a protein's shape means it can't function properly. And if our proteins and enzymes can't function properly, we won't have the appropriate chemical reactions happening. All right, and that is where we are going to stop for today. Let me know if you have any questions.